Hello, and welcome to this evening's journey through time. Tonight, we'll unfold another page of history and listen closely to the voices it left behind. Maybe you're lying in bed, phone screen dimmed, or maybe you've simply chosen to let the past keep you company for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you'd like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world and what time it is for you. If you find comfort in slow, thoughtful stories about the people who came before us, I'd be honored if you subscribed. What I'm going to show you today will completely change how you think about survival, human nature, and what people will do when faced with their own mortality. We're diving deep into the grimy, beer-soaked underbelly of Plague-era London, where alehouses became temples of denial, and every drink was a desperate prayer for one more day. But before we crack open this historical keg, let me give you some context that will make your jaw drop. The Great Plague of London wasn't just another disease outbreak. This was biological warfare on a scale that makes modern pandemics look like a minor inconvenience. We're talking about a death toll so massive that the city literally ran out of places to bury people. Mass graves were dug daily, entire neighborhoods became ghost towns overnight, and in the middle of this apocalyptic nightmare, something extraordinary happened. The survivors didn't turn to prayer, they didn't turn to medicine, and they certainly didn't turn to social distancing. Instead, they turned to the one thing that promised immediate relief from the horror surrounding them: alcohol. And not just a casual drink here and there. I'm talking about legendary multi-day benders that would make college students weep with admiration. Here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. While the wealthy fled London in droves, abandoning their mansions and businesses to escape the plague, the working class had nowhere to run. They were trapped in a city that had become a death trap, watching their friends, family, and neighbours drop like flies. So what did they do? They did what humans have done since the dawn of time when faced with unbearable reality. They found a way to make that reality bearable, even if it meant drinking themselves into oblivion. The alehouses of London became more than just drinking establishments. They transformed into makeshift sanctuaries where people gathered to forget, to numb the pain, and to pretend that tomorrow might not bring another cart full of corpses rolling down their street. These weren't just bars, they were psychological lifelines in a world gone completely mad. Now, you might be thinking, this is just another story about people drinking too much during hard times. But here's where it gets fascinating. The relationship between alcohol and plague wasn't just about escapism. There was actually a twisted logic to it that nobody talks about. Many people genuinely believed that alcohol could protect them from the plague itself. This wasn't just wishful thinking by desperate people trying to justify their drinking habits. Medical authorities of the time, such as they were, actually recommended alcohol as a preventative measure against the plague. The theory was that alcohol would purify the blood and create an internal environment hostile to the disease. Of course, we know now that this was complete nonsense, but imagine living in 1665 with no understanding of germs, bacteria, or how diseases actually spread. To these people, drinking wasn't just a way to cope with the plague. It was literally a matter of life and death prevention. Every pint of ale wasn't just drowning sorrows, it was potentially saving their life. This gave people not just permission to drink heavily, but a moral obligation to do so. How's that for a drinking excuse that puts modern justifications to shame? But the real story isn't found in the broad strokes of history books. It's in the individual tales of people who lived through this nightmare. People whose names have been largely forgotten, but whose experiences paint a vivid picture of what it was really like to live in Plague-era London. Take William Boghurst, for example. He wasn't just any random drunk stumbling through London's streets. Boghurst was actually an apothecary, essentially a pharmacist of his time, who stayed in London throughout the entire plague outbreak. While most medical professionals fled the city faster than you could say bubonic, Boghurst remained behind to treat patients. And his remedy of choice, you guessed it, alcohol. Boghurst documented his experiences in incredible detail, and his writings reveal a man who genuinely believed he was saving lives by prescribing massive quantities of alcohol to his patients. He recommended wine, ale, and spirits not just as medicine, but as the primary defense against plague infection. In his mind, he wasn't enabling an entire city's drinking problem. He was practicing cutting-edge preventative medicine. But here's where Boghurst's story gets really interesting. As the plague continued month after month, his own alcohol consumption steadily increased. What started as medical recommendations for his patients gradually became personal necessity for himself. His journals show a clear progression from professional confidence to barely controlled desperation, all lubricated by increasingly frequent visits to London's alehouses. The transformation wasn't unique to Boghurst. Across London, people who had never been heavy drinkers found themselves spending entire days in alehouses, not because they particularly enjoyed drinking, but because the alternative was confronting a reality too horrible to face sober. The psychological pressure was unlike anything most of these people had ever experienced. Consider the case of Margaret Hughes, a seamstress who lived in one of London's hardest-hit neighbourhoods. Before the plague, Margaret was known for her sobriety and religious devotion. She attended church regularly, rarely touched alcohol, and was considered a pillar of her small community. But as the plague began claiming her neighbours one by one, something inside Margaret snapped. Her transformation began innocently enough. After attending the funeral of her closest friend, Margaret stopped by an alehouse for what she told herself would be a single drink to steady her nerves. That single drink became 2, then 4, then an entire afternoon lost in the alcoholic haze. Within weeks, Margaret was spending more time in alehouses than in her own home, drinking away the coins she should have been saving for food and rent. But Margaret's story illustrates something crucial about London's plague-era drinking culture. This wasn't just individual weakness or moral failing. The entire social fabric of the city was unraveling, and alcohol became the thread that held communities together, even as it simultaneously destroyed them. The alehouses became informal community centres, where people shared news, rumours, and theories about the plague. They were places where you could find out which streets to avoid, which neighbourhoods had been quarantined, and which families had been wiped out overnight. But they were also places where truth became increasingly flexible as alcohol consumption increased. Wild theories flourished in these alcohol-fueled gatherings. Some drinkers became convinced that the plague was divine punishment for the city's sins. Others believed it was a foreign conspiracy designed to weaken England. Still others thought it was caused by bad air, evil spirits, or astrological alignments. The more people drank, the more elaborate and bizarre these theories became. This created a feedback loop that would be almost comical if it weren't so tragic. People drank to escape the terror of the plague, but the drinking created its own form of collective madness that made the entire situation even more terrifying and unpredictable. Alehouses that had once been peaceful gathering places became hotbeds of paranoia, conspiracy theories, and drunken violence. The authorities, such as they were, found themselves dealing with two separate but related crises. On one hand, they had the plague itself, which was killing thousands of people every week. On the other hand, they had a city full of drunk, desperate people whose behaviour was becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, documented numerous incidents of drunken mobs roaming London streets, breaking into abandoned houses, assaulting anyone they suspected of carrying the plague, and generally creating chaos that made an already impossible situation even worse. These weren't organised riots or political protests. They were spontaneous explosions of alcohol-fueled fear and desperation. The economic implications of London's mass drinking binge were staggering. Money that should have been spent on food, medicine, and basic necessities was instead flowing into the pockets of alehouse owners and beer brewers. Some entrepreneurs made fortunes during the plague by simply keeping their establishments open and their taps flowing. But the real cost wasn't measured in coins. It was measured in lives that might have been saved if people had made different choices, in families that might have stayed together if alcohol hadn't become more important than survival, and in a city's social structure that might have remained intact if its population hadn't chosen collective intoxication over collective action. The situation became so dire that even the city's religious leaders began to crack under the pressure. Father Thomas Whitmore, a parish priest in Southwark, had initially condemned the excessive drinking as sinful behaviour that would only invite more divine wrath. But as his congregation dwindled from hundreds to mere dozens, and then to single digits, Whitmore found himself questioning everything he'd ever believed about faith, morality, and human nature. His breaking point came on a particularly grim Tuesday morning when he discovered that his own altar boy, a 12-year-old named Timothy, had died during the night. Timothy's body was found clutched in his mother's arms, both of them victims of the same plague that had already claimed Timothy's father and 2 sisters. Whitmore was supposed to perform the burial service, but when he arrived at the mass grave that served as the parish cemetery, he couldn't bring himself to speak the familiar words of comfort and hope. Instead, Father Whitmore walked directly to the nearest alehouse and ordered a tankard of ale. Then another. By evening, the priest who had spent months condemning his parishioners' drinking habits was unconscious on a tavern floor, his religious robes soaked in spilled beer and his own vomit. When he woke up the next morning, Whitmore didn't return to his church. He spent the next 3 months in various alehouses, drinking away not just his sorrows, but his entire identity as a man of God. Whitmore's story spread quickly through London's drinking establishments, becoming a kind of twisted legend that gave other people permission to abandon whatever moral restraints had previously governed their behaviour. If even the priests were getting drunk, the logic went, then clearly God had either abandoned London entirely or was too busy to notice what his children were doing to survive. The psychological impact of seeing authority figures collapse was devastating. London had always been a city where social hierarchy mattered enormously. People knew their place, followed established rules, and looked to religious and civic leaders for guidance during difficult times. But the plague shattered all of that, when the leaders themselves became just another group of desperate drunks trying to forget their circumstances. Ordinary citizens felt completely untethered from any sense of order or meaning. This created what historians would later recognize as a unique form of social breakdown. Unlike wars or natural disasters that typically bring communities together in mutual support, the plague created such intense individual terror that collective action became almost impossible. People were too afraid of infection to help their neighbours, too suspicious of everyone around them to form meaningful bonds, and too focused on their own survival to think about the greater good. Alcohol became the great equalizer in this fractured society. In the alehouses, social distinctions temporarily disappeared. Merchants drank alongside beggars, nobles shared tables with street sweepers, and former enemies found themselves united by nothing more than their shared need to escape reality. These alcohol-induced moments of social levelling were probably the closest thing to community solidarity that plague-era London experienced. But the temporary nature of these connections only made them more desperate and intense. People formed passionate friendships over the course of a single drinking session, made grand promises to support each other through the crisis, and swore eternal loyalty to drinking companions they'd known for mere hours. Then they'd wake up the next morning, remember that getting too close to anyone meant risking infection, and return to their isolated lives until the next evening's drinking session began the cycle all over again. The alehouses themselves began to take on an almost sacred quality for their regular patrons. These weren't just places to drink anymore. They were temples of temporary forgetfulness, shrines to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, you could drink enough to make the plague disappear, at least until morning. The rituals that developed around this communal drinking were elaborate and deeply meaningful to the participants. Groups of regulars would gather at the same table every evening, order the same drinks in the same sequence, and tell the same stories about their lives before the plague arrived. These repetitive rituals served as psychological anchors in a world where everything else had become unpredictable and terrifying. The familiar rhythms of ordering drinks, sharing tales, and gradually descending into drunken oblivion provided structure and comfort that existed nowhere else in their lives. John Harwick, a blacksmith who had lost his entire family to the plague within a single week, developed an elaborate nightly routine that illustrates how deeply these drinking rituals could penetrate someone's psyche. Every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, Harwick would enter the Boar's Head Tavern, sit at the same corner table, and order 3 tankards of ale. He would drink the first one quickly, barely tasting it, just to quiet the immediate panic that seized him every time he thought about his dead wife and children. The second tankard he would drink slowly, savouring each sip while he told anyone who would listen about his family's last days. He would describe his wife's final words, his children's last meals, and the exact moment when he realised they were all going to die. This wasn't morbid fascination. It was a desperate attempt to keep their memory alive in a world where death had become so common that individual losses risked being forgotten entirely. The third tankard was always drunk in complete silence. Harwick would sit motionless, staring into the amber liquid as if it contained answers to questions he couldn't even formulate. Other patrons learned to respect this silence, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something sacred and necessary. When Harwick finally finished that third drink, he would leave without saying goodbye to anyone, walk home through London's corpse-strewn streets, and somehow manage to sleep until the next evening's ritual began again. But Harwick's story reveals another crucial aspect of London's plague-era drinking culture. The alcohol wasn't just numbing the pain of loss, it was also providing liquid courage for the daily act of continuing to live in an environment where death seemed not just possible but inevitable. Every morning, Harwick had to make a conscious choice to get out of bed, leave his house, and face another day in plague-ravaged London. That choice required a kind of bravery that most people simply don't possess naturally. The evening drinking sessions gave people like Harwick the psychological resources they needed to keep making that choice day after day. The alcohol didn't solve their problems or make their circumstances any less terrible, but it did provide a temporary respite that allowed them to gather enough strength to face another 24 hours of horror. In this sense, London's massive drinking binge wasn't just escapism, it was a survival strategy. The economic dynamics of this survival strategy created some truly bizarre situations. Money lost all normal meaning when death could arrive at any moment. People who had spent their entire lives carefully saving every penny suddenly found themselves spending their life savings on alcohol. Why save for a future that probably didn't exist? Why worry about financial security when physical security had become impossible? This shift in economic priorities created instant fortunes for anyone brave enough to keep selling alcohol during the plague. Margaret Thompson, who owned a small alehouse in Cheapside, watched her modest establishment become the most profitable business in her neighbourhood almost overnight. People were willing to pay astronomical prices for drinks, partly because money had lost its normal significance, and partly because alcohol had become more valuable than gold to people desperate for psychological relief. Thompson's success story illustrates the strange moral complexities of profiting from other people's desperation. On one hand, she was providing a service that people genuinely needed and wanted. Her alehouse offered comfort, community, and temporary escape from unbearable circumstances. On the other hand, she was essentially selling liquid false hope to people whose judgment had been compromised by terror and despair. Thompson herself struggled with these moral implications, especially as she watched regular customers drink themselves into poverty and physical ruin. But she also recognized that closing her establishment wouldn't solve anyone's problems. If people couldn't drink at her alehouse, they would simply find alcohol elsewhere, probably at higher prices and in more dangerous circumstances. At least her establishment maintained some semblance of order and safety in an increasingly chaotic city. The question of moral responsibility became even more complicated when children began appearing in London's alehouses. With so many parents dead or incapacitated, thousands of children were left to fend for themselves in the plague-ravaged city. Some of these orphan children discovered that they could earn money by running errands for drunk adults, cleaning up taverns, or simply providing companionship for people desperate for any human connection. But the presence of children in drinking establishments created situations that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. 8-year-olds were serving alcohol to adults, 12-year-olds were drinking alongside grown men and women, and teenagers were making life or death decisions about their own survival with no adult guidance whatsoever. The normal social protections that kept children safe had completely broken down, leaving them to navigate an adult world of alcohol, desperation, and moral chaos. The long-term psychological consequences of this breakdown wouldn't become apparent until years later, when the plague finally ended and survivors tried to rebuild their lives and communities. Many of the children who had spent months or years in London's alehouses never fully recovered from the experience. They had seen too much, experienced too much, and learned too young that the adult world was fundamentally unreliable and dangerous. These weren't isolated cases of childhood trauma. This was an entire generation being shaped by circumstances that no society had ever prepared for. 10-year-old Sarah Mitchell learned to brew ale by watching the adults around her, not because she was curious about the process, but because brewing meant survival. When the plague killed both her parents and left her alone in their small cottage, Sarah discovered that she could trade homemade ale for food, protection, and a place to sleep. Sarah's brewing operation became legendary among the local drinkers, not because her ale was particularly good, but because watching a child work so desperately to stay alive gave the adults around her a focal point for emotions they couldn't otherwise process. Every tankard they bought from Sarah was simultaneously an act of charity and a reminder of how completely their world had collapsed. But Sarah's story takes a darker turn when you realize that her customers weren't just buying ale from her. They were buying the illusion that they were still capable of protecting someone, even if that someone was a 10-year-old girl who shouldn't have needed protecting in the first place. The adults who patronized Sarah's makeshift brewery weren't really helping her. They were using her to feel better about their own helplessness. This dynamic played out across London in hundreds of different ways. The plague had created a city full of people desperately trying to maintain the fiction that normal social relationships still existed, even as everything around them proved the opposite. The alehouses became theatres where people could act out roles they remembered from before the plague, pretending to be customers and proprietors, friends and neighbours, protectors and protected. The performance was convincing enough that many people began to believe their own act. They started thinking that spending money on alcohol was actually a form of economic activity that helped maintain social stability. They convinced themselves that gathering in alehouses was a way of preserving community bonds rather than avoiding community responsibilities. They told themselves that drinking was medicine rather than escapism. This collective self-deception might have been sustainable if the plague had ended quickly. But as weeks turned into months, and months stretched toward a full year, the gap between reality and the alcoholic fantasy became impossible to ignore. People who had been functional drinkers at the beginning of the plague found themselves physically dependent on alcohol just to get through each day. The physical transformation was as dramatic as the psychological one. London's streets filled with people who looked like walking skeletons, their bodies ravaged not just by the constant fear of plague, but by months of poor nutrition and excessive alcohol consumption. These weren't the jolly drunks of tavern songs and popular stories. These were hollow-eyed, desperate people whose bodies were shutting down even as their minds clung to the bottle as their only source of comfort. Dr. Nathaniel Hodges, one of the few physicians who remained in London throughout the plague, documented the medical consequences of the city's drinking binge with clinical precision. His notes described patients whose livers were failing, whose stomachs couldn't process food, and whose hands shook so violently they couldn't perform basic tasks without alcohol to steady them. But Hodges also noted something that modern medical professionals would recognize immediately. Many of these people were suffering from what we now know as severe alcohol withdrawal syndrome. The problem was that in Plague-era London, there was no safe way to stop drinking once you'd become physically dependent. Alcohol withdrawal could be fatal under the best medical circumstances, and London in 1665 was definitely not the best medical circumstances. People who tried to quit drinking often experienced seizures, hallucinations, and cardiac episodes that killed them faster than the plague might have. This created a trap that ensnared thousands of Londoners. They had started drinking to cope with the plague, but now they couldn't stop drinking without risking death from withdrawal. They were literally drinking themselves to death while simultaneously being afraid to stop drinking for fear of dying. The irony would have been darkly comic if it weren't destroying so many lives. The trap wasn't just individual. Entire families found themselves caught in cycles of alcohol dependence that made their plague survival even more precarious. When both parents were drunk most of the time, children went unfed, household finances collapsed, and basic sanitation disappeared entirely. These families became plague magnets, creating exactly the kind of unsanitary conditions that helped the disease spread even faster. The Whitman family exemplifies this tragic pattern. Before the plague, Robert and Elizabeth Whitman ran a successful bakery in Bishopsgate. They employed 6 workers, owned their shop and living quarters outright, and were pillars of their local parish community. When the plague arrived, they initially responded like many small business owners by trying to maintain normal operations while taking what they believed were reasonable precautions. But as their customers began dying and their employees fled the city, the Whitmans found their carefully constructed life falling apart piece by piece. The breaking point came when their youngest daughter, Mary, developed the telltale buboes that marked plague infection. Elizabeth spent 3 days nursing Mary through the agony of the disease, watching helplessly as her child died slowly and painfully. After Mary's death, Elizabeth couldn't bring herself to enter the bakery. The smell of bread reminded her too strongly of the morning she had been planning Mary's birthday celebration, just days before the plague symptoms appeared. Robert tried to continue working alone, but found that his hands shook too badly to knead dough properly. Their solution was the same one chosen by thousands of other Londoners. They started drinking. Within a month, the Whitmans had sold their bakery equipment to pay for alcohol. Within 2 months, they had sold their furniture. By the 3rd month, they were living in a single room above what had once been their thriving business, spending every waking hour in nearby alehouses and returning home only to collapse into unconsciousness. The physical decline was swift and brutal. Robert, who had been a strong, healthy man in his 40s, began experiencing liver problems that left him weak and jaundiced. Elizabeth developed a persistent cough that she tried to drown with wine, not realizing that the alcohol was actually making her respiratory problems worse. But the psychological decline was even more devastating than the physical deterioration. The Whitmans began to experience what modern psychologists would recognize as dissociative episodes. They would spend hours in alehouses, convinced that Mary was still alive, planning elaborate conversations they were going to have with her when they returned home. They would discuss business plans for reopening the bakery, even though they had already sold all their equipment and had no money to replace it. They created an entire alternative reality that existed only in their alcohol-addled minds. Other patrons in their regular alehouses learned to play along with these delusions, partly out of kindness, and partly because the Whitmans' fantasy world was more pleasant than the actual reality everyone was living through. The alehouses became stages for elaborate performances where everyone pretended that the plague wasn't happening, that their families were still alive, and that tomorrow would somehow be better than today. But these performances required increasingly large amounts of alcohol to maintain. As tolerance built up, people needed more and more drinks to achieve the same level of psychological escape. The economic burden became crushing. But the psychological need was even more demanding. People sold everything they owned, borrowed money they knew they could never repay, and resorted to theft and fraud to maintain their access to alcohol. The crime rate in London skyrocketed, but not in the way you might expect during a social breakdown. Instead of organized criminal gangs or violent uprisings, the city was plagued by thousands of small-scale, desperate crimes committed by people who needed money for their next drink. Pickpocketing increased dramatically, but so did bizarre crimes like stealing communion wine from churches or breaking into abandoned houses specifically to search for hidden alcohol stores. The authorities found themselves dealing with criminals who were more pathetic than dangerous. These weren't hardened lawbreakers pursuing criminal careers. They were ordinary citizens who had been pushed beyond their psychological breaking points and were making increasingly irrational decisions to maintain their only source of psychological relief. Thomas Hartwell, a former cloth merchant, was arrested for stealing a silver candlestick from St. Paul's Cathedral. When brought before the magistrate, Hartwell couldn't explain why he had taken the candlestick or what he planned to do with it. Under questioning, it became clear that Hartwell had been so drunk when he committed the theft that he had no memory of the incident at all. He had simply wandered into the cathedral, seen something shiny, and taken it without any conscious plan or purpose. Hartwell's case illustrates how alcohol had begun to affect people's decision-making capabilities in ways that went far beyond simple impairment. The constant drinking was literally changing brain chemistry, making it impossible for people to think clearly about consequences, plan for the future, or make rational choices about their own survival. They were operating on pure instinct, and their instincts were telling them that alcohol was more important than food, shelter, safety, or dignity. The legal system, already overwhelmed by plague-related chaos, found itself completely unprepared to deal with thousands of cases like Hartwell's. Jails were already overcrowded with plague victims who had been quarantined by force. Courts were understaffed because many judges and lawyers had fled the city. The few legal officials who remained were often drunk themselves, making fair trials virtually impossible. This breakdown in legal authority created a feedback loop that made the drinking problem even worse. When people realized that crimes were unlikely to be prosecuted effectively, some began stealing alcohol directly rather than stealing money to buy alcohol. Alehouses were robbed regularly, not by professional criminals seeking valuable goods, but by desperate addicts who needed immediate access to drinks. The violence that accompanied these thefts was particularly disturbing because it was so random and purposeless. Unlike normal criminal violence, which typically has clear motives and targets, plague-era alcohol crimes were characterized by confused, desperate people lashing out at anyone who stood between them and their next drink. Alehouse owners were beaten by customers who couldn't pay their tabs. Innocent bystanders were attacked by drunk people who mistook them for threats. Families were torn apart by members who stole from each other to support their drinking habits. Mary Godwin watched her own brother transform from a loving family member into a dangerous stranger over the course of just 6 weeks. Before the plague, James had been Mary's closest confidant and protector. He was the person she turned to for advice, comfort, and practical help with the challenges of daily life. When the plague began claiming their neighbours, James initially took charge of his family's survival preparations, with characteristic competence and care. But the psychological pressure of trying to protect people he loved in circumstances beyond anyone's control gradually broke James down. He started drinking to steady his nerves before making decisions about where the family should go, what supplies they should buy, and how they should respond to each new crisis. The drinking helped initially, giving James the confidence he needed to take action in situations where paralysis might have been fatal. The problem was that James's responsibilities kept growing more complex and terrifying, while his ability to handle them was being steadily eroded by alcohol. Within weeks, he was drunk during most of his waking hours, making increasingly poor decisions that put his entire family at greater risk. He spent money they needed for food on alcohol instead. He got into fights with neighbors who might have provided mutual aid and protection. He made enemies of people who had previously been allies. Mary's breaking point came when she discovered that James had sold her deceased mother's jewelry, the family's most valuable possessions, to pay gambling debts he had incurred while drunk. The jewelry wasn't just financially valuable. It represented the family's connection to their past, their hopes for the future, and their mother's love for her children. James had traded all of that away for a few hours of alcohol-fueled entertainment that he couldn't even remember clearly. When Mary confronted James about the theft, she encountered someone she barely recognized. The brother who had once been her protector was now a hollow-eyed stranger who couldn't meet her gaze, couldn't explain his actions, and couldn't promise that he wouldn't do something similar again. The plague had taken Mary's parents, but alcohol had taken her brother. In some ways, the second loss was even more devastating because it felt preventable and personal in a way that disease wasn't. James's transformation from protector to threat illustrates one of the most heartbreaking aspects of London's plague-era drinking crisis. Families that had managed to stay together despite the disease found themselves torn apart by alcohol addiction. The very people who should have been sources of mutual support became sources of additional danger and stress. Home, which should have been a refuge from the horrors of the plague-ravaged city, became another place where survival was uncertain. The children caught in these situations faced impossible choices. They could stay with family members who were no longer reliable protectors, risking abuse, neglect, or being dragged into dangerous situations by drunk relatives. Or they could strike out on their own in a city where unaccompanied children were vulnerable to every form of exploitation and violence imaginable. Either choice could be fatal, but staying meant watching people you loved destroy themselves and possibly taking you with them. 15-year-old William Morrison chose to leave his family when his father's drinking made their household too dangerous to inhabit. William's father had been a respected carpenter before the plague, known for his skill, reliability, and sobriety. But watching his wife die of plague while he was powerless to help her had shattered something fundamental in the older man's psyche. He began drinking heavily, neglecting his work, and becoming increasingly violent toward William and his younger sister. The violence wasn't calculated or purposeful. William's father wasn't an evil man who suddenly decided to abuse his children. He was a broken man whose grief and terror were expressing themselves through alcohol-fueled rage that he couldn't control or even fully remember. But the motivation didn't matter to William, who found himself responsible for protecting his 12-year-old sister from their own father. William's solution was to take his sister and leave their home, joining the thousands of other children who were living rough in London's streets during the plague. They survived by begging, stealing, and accepting charity from adults who were themselves barely surviving. William learned to identify which alehouses were safe places where sympathetic drinkers might share food or offer temporary shelter, and which establishments were controlled by dangerous people who would exploit vulnerable children. The knowledge William acquired during those months on the street was comprehensive and disturbing. He learned to recognize the signs that indicated when a drunk person was becoming violent, how to identify adults who were desperate enough to pay children for services that ranged from running errands to providing companionship. He learned which neighborhoods were controlled by criminal gangs and which areas were simply chaotic, free-for-all zones where anything could happen. Most importantly, William learned that survival in plague-era London required a kind of moral flexibility that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. He stole food from vendors who probably couldn't afford the loss. He lied to adults who were trying to help him because telling the truth might reveal information that could endanger his sister. He made alliances with people he didn't trust because isolation meant certain death. The psychological toll of these compromises was enormous, but William didn't have the luxury of maintaining his pre-plague moral standards. The world had changed too dramatically for old rules to apply. The adults who should have been protecting children like William were too drunk, too scared, or too dead to fulfill their responsibilities. Society's normal support systems had completely broken down, leaving children to create their own survival strategies using whatever resources they could find. The resourcefulness that children like William developed during London's plague crisis reveals something profound about human adaptability, but it also exposes the horrifying reality of what happens when an entire society's protective structures collapse simultaneously. These weren't isolated cases of individual hardship. This was systematic abandonment of an entire generation, fueled by a citywide addiction that prioritized immediate escape over long-term survival. The alehouses where William sought occasional refuge had evolved into something unprecedented in London's history. They weren't just drinking establishments anymore. They had become informal social service centres, black markets, employment agencies, and therapy sessions all rolled into establishments that reeked of spilled ale and human desperation. The transformation was so complete that many of these places bore little resemblance to their pre-plague incarnations. Consider the Blue Anchor Tavern in Southwark, which before the plague had been a respectable establishment frequented by merchants, craftsmen, and their families. The tavern served decent food, hosted community celebrations, and maintained the kind of orderly atmosphere where business deals were conducted and marriages were arranged. Owner Richard Blackwood took pride in running what he called a civilized house where excessive drinking was discouraged and troublemakers were swiftly ejected. But as the plague tightened its grip on London, the Blue Anchor underwent a radical transformation that mirrored the city's broader descent into alcoholic chaos. Blackwood initially tried to maintain his establishment's respectable character, but discovered that respectability was a luxury he couldn't afford when survival was at stake. His regular customers were either dead or had fled London, leaving him with a choice between serving whoever walked through his doors or closing permanently. The new clientele that filled the Blue Anchor represented every level of London society, united only by their shared desperation and their need for alcohol. Former nobles sat beside common labourers, sharing tables and bottles with a familiarity that would have been scandalous under normal circumstances. Wealthy merchants who had lost their fortunes to plague-related business collapses drank alongside pickpockets and prostitutes, all of them equal in their current circumstances. Blackwood discovered that his customers weren't just buying alcohol, they were purchasing temporary membership in a community that existed nowhere else in plague-ravaged London. The Blue Anchor became a place where people could pretend that social bonds still existed, that human connection was still possible, and that tomorrow might offer something other than death or despair. But maintaining this illusion required increasingly creative approaches to both alcohol service and crowd management. Blackwood found himself functioning less as a tavern keeper and more as a combination therapist, mediator, loan shark, and social director. He learned to recognize when customers were approaching violent breaking points and developed strategies for diffusing conflicts before they erupted into full-scale brawls. The violence, when it did occur, had a quality unlike anything Blackwood had witnessed during his years in the hospitality business. These weren't typical tavern fights over gambling debts or romantic rivalries. These were explosions of accumulated grief, terror, and frustration that had been building for months without any healthy outlet for expression. People fought over trivial matters with an intensity that seemed completely disproportionate to the actual stakes involved. One evening in late September, Blackwood watched two customers nearly kill each other over a spilled drink. The incident began when Robert Ashford, a former goldsmith who had lost his entire family to plague, accidentally knocked over Thomas Wright's tankard while reaching for his own. Under normal circumstances, this would have warranted an apology and possibly an offer to buy a replacement drink. Instead, Wright responded by smashing his remaining tankard over Ashford's head, opening a gash that bled profusely onto the tavern floor. Ashford's retaliation was swift and brutal. Despite being stunned by the blow to his head, He grabbed a wooden stool and began beating Wright with a methodical violence that terrified the other customers. This wasn't a spontaneous fight between drunk men. This was a systematic attempt by one broken human being to transfer his pain to another person through physical force. The other patrons initially tried to intervene, but quickly realized that both men were far beyond reason. Wright and Ashford were no longer fighting each other. They were fighting the plague, the deaths of their families, the collapse of their world, and their own helplessness in the face of circumstances beyond anyone's control. The spilled drink had simply provided a convenient excuse for expressing emotions that had no other outlet. Blackwood eventually ended the fight by threatening both men with a loaded pistol, but the incident left him shaken in ways that went beyond concern for his establishment's safety. He realized that his tavern wasn't providing the community support and social stability he had imagined. Instead, it was serving as a pressure valve for a level of collective trauma that alcohol couldn't actually heal. The recognition forced Blackwood to confront uncomfortable truths about his own role in London's drinking crisis. Was he providing a valuable service to people who desperately needed social connection and psychological relief? Or was he enabling destructive behavior that made his customers' situations even worse? The moral complexity of the question became more troubling as he watched regular patrons deteriorate physically and mentally despite spending most of their waking hours in his establishment. Eleanor Hartwell's decline provided Blackwood with a particularly painful example of these moral ambiguities. Eleanor had been one of his first plague-era customers, arriving at the Blue Anchor in early summer as a recently widowed woman seeking temporary comfort after her husband's death. She was articulate, well-dressed, and clearly from a respectable background. Her initial visits were brief and moderate, just an hour or two of quiet drinking while she processed her grief. But Eleanor's brief visits gradually extended into entire afternoons, then full days, and finally into what amounted to permanent residence at the Blue Anchor. She developed elaborate routines around her drinking that gave structure to days that would otherwise have been unbearably empty. She had favourite tables, preferred drinking companions, and complex theories about which ales provided the best escape from her memories of her deceased husband. Blackwood watched Eleanor transform from a dignified widow into something that barely resembled the person she had been just months earlier. Her clothes became ragged and stained. Her speech became slurred and repetitive. Her personal hygiene deteriorated to the point where other customers complained about sitting near her. But most disturbing was the way her personality seemed to fragment under the constant influence of alcohol. During her sober moments, which became increasingly rare, Eleanor would express horror at her own behaviour and make elaborate promises to change her drinking habits. She would apologise to other customers for arguments she couldn't remember, pledge to return home and resume a normal life, and speak eloquently about her plans for the future. These moments of clarity were heartbreaking because they revealed that somewhere inside the alcoholic wreck Eleanor had become, the intelligent, capable woman she had once been was still struggling to emerge. But the clarity never lasted long enough for Eleanor to act on her good intentions. Within hours, sometimes within minutes, she would be drinking again, and the cycle of deterioration would continue. Blackwood found himself caught between wanting to help her and recognizing that he had no idea how to provide the kind of help she actually needed. The situation became even more complicated when Eleanor began offering sexual services to other customers in exchange for drinks. This wasn't prostitution in any organized sense. Eleanor wasn't working for a pimp or trying to establish a business. She was simply trading the only resource she had left for the alcohol she needed to function. The arrangements were pathetic rather than commercial, desperate rather than calculated. Blackwood's initial response was to forbid such activities in his establishment, but he quickly discovered that enforcement was almost impossible. The transactions happened quickly and quietly, often involving customers who were too drunk to remember the details clearly. Eleanor herself often had no memory of what she had agreed to do, or what she had received in return. The entire situation existed in a moral and legal grey area that defied traditional categories of right and wrong. More troubling was Blackwood's growing recognition that Eleanor's situation wasn't unique. Across London, the plague crisis had created thousands of people whose lives had been so completely destroyed that they were willing to trade anything for temporary relief from their circumstances. The normal social and economic structures that might have provided support for people like Eleanor had either collapsed entirely or become inaccessible to those who needed them most. The churches, which traditionally served as sources of charity and moral guidance during times of crisis, were largely empty. Many priests had fled the city, and those who remained were overwhelmed by the sheer scope of human need they encountered. The few religious leaders who tried to address London's drinking problem found themselves preaching to congregations that had dwindled to single digits, while the alehouses overflowed with people seeking different forms of spiritual comfort. Father Marcus Whitfield made valiant attempts to provide alternative gathering places for people who might otherwise spend their time drinking. He organised prayer meetings, distributed food to hungry families, and tried to create support networks for plague survivors who were struggling with grief and trauma. But his efforts were consistently undermined by the simple fact that alcohol provided immediate relief, while religion offered only long-term promises that many people no longer believed. Whitfield's frustration reached a breaking point when he discovered that some of his most devoted parishioners were attending his services while intoxicated. These weren't people who were mocking religion or trying to cause disruption. They were sincere believers who found that alcohol made it possible for them to participate in religious activities that would otherwise be too emotionally overwhelming to endure. The situation forced Whitfield to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between faith and suffering that his theological training hadn't prepared him to answer. If people needed to be drunk to find comfort in religious services, was that a failure of faith or a practical adaptation to circumstances that exceeded normal human endurance? If alcohol provided more immediate and reliable comfort than prayer, what did that say about the nature of divine providence during times of extreme crisis? These weren't abstract theological questions for Whitfield. They were intensely personal challenges that affected his ability to provide meaningful guidance to people who were looking to him for answers he simply didn't have. The traditional religious responses to suffering and loss seemed inadequate when applied to the scale of trauma that London was experiencing during the plague. Whitfield's crisis of faith deepened when he began to notice that his own response to the overwhelming nature of his pastoral duties was to drink more than he ever had before. He started with small amounts of communion wine to steady his nerves before conducting funeral services. The wine helped him maintain his composure while blessing the bodies of parishioners he had known for years, people whose deaths felt personal and devastating rather than part of some larger divine plan. The communion wine gradually became a regular part of Whitfield's daily routine, not just during religious services, but whenever he felt overwhelmed by the scope of human misery he was expected to address. He told himself that the drinking was medicinal, a necessary tool that allowed him to continue serving his congregation during impossibly difficult circumstances. But he also recognized that his justifications sounded remarkably similar to those offered by the parishioners whose drinking habits he had initially criticized. The parallel became even more uncomfortable when Whitfield realized that his most effective pastoral work was happening not in his church, but in the alehouses where his parishioners spent most of their time. If he wanted to provide spiritual guidance and comfort to his flock, he needed to meet them where they were, rather than expecting them to come to him. This meant spending increasing amounts of time in drinking establishments, participating in the same alcohol-centered social activities that he had once condemned. Whitfield's transformation from judgmental observer to active participant in London's drinking culture illustrates how the plague crisis broke down traditional moral and social categories in ways that left everyone scrambling to find new frameworks for understanding right and wrong. The clear distinctions between virtue and vice, between helping and enabling, between spiritual guidance and worldly indulgence, became impossible to maintain when survival itself required constant moral improvisation. The improvisation wasn't limited to individual choices about drinking and moral behavior. Entire institutions were forced to adapt their traditional functions to accommodate the reality of a population that was largely intoxicated most of the time. Courts learned to conduct legal proceedings with drunk defendants, witnesses, and sometimes judges. Merchants developed new business practices for dealing with customers whose decision-making abilities were compromised by constant alcohol consumption. Even the city's rudimentary medical establishment had to adjust their treatment approaches to account for patients whose symptoms were complicated by chronic intoxication. Dr. William Sydenham, one of the few physicians who remained in London throughout the plague, documented the medical challenges of treating patients who were simultaneously suffering from plague symptoms and alcohol poisoning. The combination created diagnostic puzzles that were almost impossible to solve with the medical knowledge available in 1665. Symptoms that might indicate plague infection could also be signs of severe alcohol withdrawal. Treatments that might help with one condition could be fatal when applied to the other. Sydenham's medical notes reveal the extent to which London's drinking crisis had become a public health emergency that was separate from, but intertwined with, the plague itself. He estimated that at least 30% of his patients were suffering from alcohol-related medical conditions that had nothing to do with plague infection. These weren't people who had contracted the plague and were drinking to cope with their symptoms. These were people whose drinking habits had made them sick in ways that mimicked plague symptoms, creating false alarms and consuming medical resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. The false alarms were particularly problematic because they contributed to the general atmosphere of panic and confusion that made rational responses to the actual plague more difficult. Families would rush sick relatives to physicians, convinced that plague symptoms were appearing, only to discover that the patient was simply experiencing severe alcohol withdrawal. The relief of learning that a loved one didn't have plague was often followed by the devastating realization that they were instead suffering from a different but equally dangerous condition. Sydenham's attempts to treat alcohol-related medical conditions were hampered by the fact that the only effective treatment for severe alcohol withdrawal was gradual reduction in drinking, which required a level of personal discipline and social support that simply didn't exist in plague-era London. Patients who were physically dependent on alcohol couldn't safely stop drinking without medical supervision. But Sydenham lacked both the knowledge and the resources to provide the kind of intensive care that successful alcohol withdrawal required. The medical challenges were compounded by social attitudes toward drinking that made it difficult for people to recognize when their alcohol consumption had become genuinely dangerous. In a city where everyone was drinking heavily as a response to extraordinary circumstances, the line between acceptable coping behavior and self-destructive addiction became impossible to identify clearly. People who might have sought help for drinking problems under normal circumstances convinced themselves that their consumption levels were reasonable given the situation they were facing. This collective denial extended beyond individual self-assessment to include family members, friends, and community leaders who might otherwise have intervened when someone's drinking became problematic. When everyone was using alcohol to cope with trauma and terror, it became much harder to recognize when someone had crossed the line from functional drinking to dangerous addiction. The social mechanisms that typically helped identify and address alcohol problems had been overwhelmed by the sheer number of people who were drinking at dangerous levels. Margaret Thornton's family provides a tragic example of how this collective denial could prevent intervention, even when the need was obvious to outside observers. Margaret had been a moderate drinker before the plague, enjoying an occasional glass of wine with dinner but never consuming enough alcohol to affect her daily functioning. When the plague killed her 2 young sons within the same week, Margaret's drinking increased dramatically as she struggled to process grief that seemed too enormous for any human being to bear. Her husband, David, initially supported Margaret's increased drinking because he recognized that she needed some form of relief from the intensity of her emotional pain. David was dealing with his own grief over the loss of their children and he understood the appeal of anything that promised temporary escape from unbearable feelings. He bought wine for Margaret, made excuses for her when she was too drunk to fulfill social obligations, and protected her from criticism by well-meaning neighbours who expressed concern about her drinking habits. But Margaret's drinking continued to escalate long after the acute phase of her grief had passed. Within months, she was consuming dangerous amounts of alcohol every day, starting with wine at breakfast and continuing steadily until she lost consciousness each evening. Her physical health began to deteriorate rapidly. She lost weight, developed a persistent cough, and experienced tremors in her hands that made it difficult for her to perform basic tasks. David watched these changes with growing alarm, but found himself unable to take action because he couldn't identify a clear moment when Margaret's drinking had transitioned from understandable grief response to dangerous addiction. The change had been gradual, and each day's consumption seemed only slightly higher than the previous days. By the time David recognized that Margaret was in serious physical danger, she was already too dependent on alcohol to stop drinking, without experiencing potentially fatal withdrawal symptoms. The family situation was further complicated by David's own relationship with alcohol, which had also changed significantly since their children's deaths. While David hadn't become as severely addicted as Margaret, he was drinking much more than he ever had before, using alcohol to numb his own grief and to cope with the stress of watching his wife destroy herself. His judgment about Margaret's condition was compromised by his own altered relationship with drinking, making it difficult for him to assess the situation objectively. The Thorntons' story illustrates how the plague crisis created family dynamics that trapped people in destructive patterns, even when they recognized that changes were necessary. David knew that Margaret needed help, and Margaret herself had moments of clarity when she understood that her drinking was destroying her health. But neither of them had access to the kind of support systems that might have made recovery possible, and both of them were operating with impaired judgment that made rational decision-making extremely difficult. The lack of effective intervention options meant that families like the Thorntons were essentially on their own when dealing with alcohol-related crises. The traditional sources of help, religious leaders, medical professionals, and extended family networks were either unavailable or overwhelmed by their own plague-related problems. People were forced to improvise solutions to complex addiction issues without any real understanding of what effective treatment might involve. Some families developed their own intervention strategies that ranged from creative to desperate to downright dangerous. The Fletcher family tried to help their alcoholic patriarch by hiding all the alcohol in their house and physically restraining him when he tried to leave to find drinks elsewhere. The approach backfires spectacularly when the father, Jonathan Fletcher, experienced severe withdrawal symptoms that included seizures and hallucinations. The family's attempt to help nearly killed him, and they were forced to resume providing him with alcohol just to keep him alive. Other families took different approaches that reflected their own understanding of addiction and recovery. The Morrison family tried to gradually reduce their mother's alcohol consumption by diluting her drinks with water, hoping that she wouldn't notice the difference and would slowly become accustomed to consuming less alcohol. The strategy failed because their mother quickly detected the dilution and simply drank larger quantities to achieve the same level of intoxication. The desperate creativity that families brought to these intervention attempts reveals both the depth of their love for addicted relatives and their complete lack of knowledge about how addiction actually works. These weren't people who were indifferent to their family members' suffering. They were people who were willing to try almost anything to help, but who had no access to accurate information about effective treatment approaches. The information vacuum was filled by folk remedies, superstitions, and theories that had no basis in medical reality, but offered hope to desperate families. Some people believed that certain foods could counteract the effects of excessive alcohol consumption. Others thought that specific prayers or religious rituals could cure addiction. Still others developed elaborate theories about the relationship between alcohol and plague that led them to conclude that drinking was actually protective rather than harmful. These alternative theories about alcohol's effects gained credibility because they were often promoted by people who had impressive credentials in other areas. Wealthy merchants who had successfully managed complex businesses before the plague offered advice about treating addiction based on their experience with managing human behavior in commercial contexts. Religious leaders who had provided effective spiritual guidance under normal circumstances applied theological frameworks to addiction issues that were completely outside their areas of expertise. The result was a city full of people who were confidently dispensing advice about alcohol addiction based on theories that were completely wrong but sounded plausible to people who were desperate for answers. The bad advice wasn't malicious, but it was often actively harmful, encouraging people to pursue treatment strategies that made their situations worse rather than better. Samuel Whitmore's experience with these competing theories nearly cost him his life. Samuel had been drinking heavily since the plague killed his wife and 3 children, but he recognized that his consumption levels were becoming dangerous and wanted to reduce his drinking before it destroyed his health entirely. He sought advice from multiple sources, hoping to find a treatment approach that would allow him to regain control over his alcohol consumption. The first person Samuel consulted was his neighbor, Robert Hayes, who had successfully managed his own drinking during the early stages of the plague. Hayes recommended that Samuel try to maintain a consistent daily alcohol intake rather than trying to stop drinking entirely. The theory was that steady consumption would prevent the dangerous fluctuations that led to withdrawal symptoms while allowing Samuel's body to gradually adjust to lower alcohol levels. Samuel followed Hayes's advice for several weeks, carefully measuring his daily alcohol consumption and trying to maintain consistent intake levels. But he discovered that maintaining consistency was much more difficult than Hayes had suggested. Samuel's alcohol tolerance continued to increase, which meant that he needed larger amounts to achieve the same effects. His carefully measured daily intake gradually increased until he was drinking even more than he had been before seeking help. The second piece of advice came from Father Morrison, who suggested that Samuel try to replace his alcohol consumption with intensive prayer and religious contemplation. Morrison's theory was that addiction was fundamentally a spiritual problem that required spiritual solutions rather than medical or behavioral interventions. He recommended that Samuel spend the time he would normally spend drinking in prayer and religious study instead. Samuel made a sincere attempt to follow Morrison's guidance, but discovered that prayer and religious contemplation actually increased his craving for alcohol rather than reducing it. The quiet reflection that Morrison recommended gave Samuel more time to think about his losses and his fears, which intensified the emotional pain that he had been using alcohol to escape. Within days, Samuel was drinking more heavily than ever, while also feeling guilty about his failure to find comfort in religious activities. The third source of advice was Dr. Reynolds, who had developed his own theory about the relationship between alcohol and plague. Reynolds believed that people who had been drinking heavily during the plague had built up a form of immunity that protected them from infection, but that sudden reduction in alcohol consumption could make them vulnerable to the disease. He recommended that Samuel continue drinking at current levels until the plague ended, then gradually reduce his consumption once the immediate health threat had passed. Reynolds's advice gave Samuel permission to continue his dangerous drinking habits while convincing himself that he was making a medically sound decision. The theory was appealing because it transformed Samuel's addiction from a personal failure into a reasonable health precaution. But the advice was also potentially fatal because it encouraged Samuel to maintain alcohol consumption levels that were already causing serious physical damage. The conflicting advice left Samuel more confused and desperate than he had been before seeking help. Each expert had sounded confident and knowledgeable, but their recommendations were completely incompatible with each other. Samuel couldn't follow all 3 pieces of advice simultaneously, but he also couldn't determine which expert was most likely to be correct. The uncertainty paralyzed his ability to take any action at all, and his drinking continued to escalate while he tried to decide which treatment approach to pursue. Samuel's experience was replicated thousands of times across plague-era London as people sought help for alcohol problems from sources that were completely unqualified to provide effective guidance. The tragedy wasn't that help was unavailable. The tragedy was that so much bad help was available that people often became worse off after seeking assistance than they had been before trying to address their problems. The proliferation of bad advice about addiction treatment was symptomatic of a larger breakdown in London's information systems during the plague crisis. Traditional sources of reliable information, universities, medical colleges, and established religious authorities had either fled the city or were too overwhelmed by immediate crisis management to provide thoughtful guidance about complex long-term problems like addiction. The information vacuum was filled by anyone who was confident enough to offer opinions, regardless of whether those opinions were based on actual knowledge or experience. This created an environment where dangerous misinformation could spread just as rapidly as accurate information, and where people who were suffering from serious medical conditions were likely to encounter more bad advice than good advice when they sought help. The misinformation wasn't just ineffective, it was often actively harmful, encouraging people to pursue treatment strategies that made their conditions worse or prevented them from seeking more appropriate help. The misinformation crisis created by London's collapsing information systems had consequences that extended far beyond individual treatment failures. When people couldn't trust expert advice about addiction, they also began questioning other forms of medical and social guidance that might have helped them survive the plague more effectively. The breakdown in credible authority created a city full of people who were making life and death decisions based on rumours, superstitions, and theories that had no basis in reality. Martha Blackwell's tragic end illustrates how dangerous this information chaos could become. Martha had managed to maintain relatively moderate drinking habits through the first months of the plague, despite losing her husband and eldest son to the disease. She was one of the few people in her neighbourhood who still maintained a functional household, caring for her 2 surviving children while working as a seamstress to earn enough money for basic necessities. Martha's controlled approach to survival began to unravel when she encountered a theory that was spreading rapidly through London's alehouses in late autumn. The theory claimed that people who maintained perfect sobriety during the plague were actually more likely to contract the disease because their bodies lacked the purifying effects of alcohol. According to this belief system, moderate drinking was dangerous because it provided insufficient protection, while heavy drinking offered complete immunity from plague infection. The theory gained credibility because it was being promoted by several people who had survived obvious plague exposure while maintaining heavy drinking habits. These survivors became living testimonials to alcohol's protective powers, sharing their stories in alehouses where desperate people were hungry for any information that might improve their chances of survival. The fact that these testimonials came from actual plague survivors rather than medical experts made them seem more credible than official health guidance. Martha initially dismissed the theory as wishful thinking by people who wanted to justify their excessive drinking. But as she heard more survival stories and watched more of her sober neighbours succumb to plague infection, she began to wonder whether her moderate approach might actually be putting her family at greater risk. The possibility that she might be endangering her children by maintaining sobriety became an obsessive worry that dominated her thoughts. The turning point came when Martha's next-door neighbour, Catherine Mills, died of plague despite having consumed no alcohol at all during the entire crisis. Catherine had been a devoutly religious woman who believed that maintaining perfect sobriety was a moral obligation during times of trial. She had prayed daily for protection, maintained strict religious observances, and avoided all the behaviours that other people were using to cope with the plague crisis. Catherine's death shattered Martha's confidence in her own survival strategy. If sobriety and religious devotion couldn't protect someone as virtuous as Catherine, then perhaps the alcohol immunity theory deserved more serious consideration. Martha began drinking heavily for the first time in her life, not because she enjoyed the effects of alcohol, but because she had become convinced that her children's lives depended on her willingness to consume enough alcohol to achieve protective immunity. The transformation was swift and devastating. Within weeks, Martha was spending money needed for food and heating fuel on alcohol instead. Her sewing work, which required steady hands and clear vision, became impossible to perform while intoxicated. The household, that had been a model of plague-era survival, began to collapse as Martha's drinking escalated beyond any reasonable level. Martha's children watched their competent, caring mother transform into someone they barely recognized. 8-year-old Susan tried to take over household responsibilities that were far beyond her capabilities, while 6-year-old Peter began showing signs of severe emotional distress that manifested as nightmares, loss of appetite, and periods of uncontrollable crying. The children were losing their mother to alcohol addiction. At the same time, they were trying to process the deaths of their father and older brother. The irony of Martha's situation was that her drinking, which was supposed to protect her family from plague infection, actually made them more vulnerable to every other form of danger that plagued London during the crisis. Martha's intoxication made her an easy target for the criminals who preyed on vulnerable households. Her inability to maintain basic sanitation created exactly the kind of unsanitary conditions that helped diseases spread. Her failure to earn income meant that the family couldn't afford adequate food or fuel, weakening their immune systems and making them more susceptible to all forms of illness. Martha's story might have ended differently if she had encountered accurate information about alcohol's actual effects on disease resistance. But in plague-era London, accurate medical information was almost impossible to find, while dangerous misinformation was abundant and convincing. People like Martha were making medical decisions that affected their entire families based on theories that sounded plausible, but were completely wrong. The alcohol immunity theory was just one of dozens of dangerous misconceptions that flourished in London's information-starved environment. Other popular theories claimed that certain types of alcohol provided better protection than others, that drinking at specific times of day was more effective than random consumption, and that alcohol needed to be combined with particular foods or prayers to achieve maximum protective effects. These elaborate theories gave people the illusion that they were taking rational, scientific approaches to plague prevention when they were actually engaging in behaviors that made their situations worse. The complexity of the theories made them seem more credible than simple advice, and the specific details gave people a sense of control over circumstances that were actually beyond anyone's ability to manage. Edmund Hartwell became obsessed with one particularly complex alcohol immunity theory that required precise timing and measurement. Plague immunity could only be achieved by consuming of drinks throughout the day. According to this system, specific amounts of different types of alcohol at predetermined intervals, with the exact quantities and timing adjusted based on factors like body weight, age, and previous plague exposure. Hartwell spent enormous amounts of time and money trying to follow this system perfectly, measuring his drinks with scientific precision and maintaining detailed records of his consumption patterns. He convinced himself that any deviation from the prescribed regimen would leave him vulnerable to plague infection, so he prioritized alcohol purchases over food, rent, and other basic necessities. The system became more important to Hartwell than his actual survival, and he eventually died of malnutrition while maintaining perfect compliance with his alcohol immunity protocol. The tragic absurdity of Hartwell's situation illustrates how the human need for control and understanding can lead people to embrace complex, nonsensical systems, rather than acknowledge that some circumstances are simply beyond rational management. The alcohol immunity theories provided psychological comfort by suggesting that survival was possible through careful adherence to specific behaviors, even when those behaviors were actually counterproductive. The proliferation of these theories also reveals how desperate people were for any form of hope during the plague crisis. The official response to the plague was essentially to wait for it to end naturally, which offered no sense of agency or control to people who were watching their communities disintegrate around them. The alcohol immunity theories, however wrong they might have been, gave people something active they could do to improve their chances of survival. The psychological appeal of these active interventions helps explain why so many intelligent, rational people embraced obviously flawed theories about alcohol and plague prevention. The alternative was to accept complete helplessness in the face of circumstances that seemed designed to destroy everything they valued. Most people found active engagement with wrong theories more psychologically tolerable than passive acceptance of accurate but hopeless assessments of their situation. Dr. James Whittaker, one of the few medically trained professionals who remained in London throughout the plague, documented his frustration with trying to combat dangerous misinformation while lacking access to effective treatments that he could offer as alternatives. Whittaker knew that the alcohol immunity theories were medically nonsensical, but he also recognized that telling people to stop drinking without offering them better hope for survival was unlikely to be persuasive. Whittaker's dilemma was that 17th century medicine had no effective treatments for plague infection. The best medical advice he could offer was basic hygiene, adequate nutrition, and avoidance of infected areas, but all of these recommendations required resources and circumstances that most Londoners simply didn't have access to. When people asked Whittaker whether drinking alcohol would protect them from plague, he could say that it wouldn't, but he couldn't offer them anything better to do instead. The inadequacy of official medical guidance created space for alternative theories to flourish, even when those theories were promoted by people who had no medical training whatsoever. A blacksmith who had survived obvious plague exposure while drinking heavily could offer more compelling advice than a trained physician who had to admit that medical science had no solutions to the crisis people were facing. Whittaker eventually stopped trying to combat alcohol immunity theories because he realized that his corrections were causing more harm than the misinformation itself. When he told people that drinking wouldn't protect them from plague, many became so discouraged that they stopped taking any survival precautions at all. The false hope provided by alcohol immunity theories, however medically inaccurate, at least motivated people to continue trying to survive rather than giving up entirely. The compromise that many medical professionals like Whittaker eventually reached was to focus on harm reduction rather than accuracy. Instead of telling people that alcohol provided no plague protection, they began offering advice about safer drinking practices that might reduce the medical complications associated with heavy alcohol consumption. The approach wasn't ideal, but it was more practical than trying to convince desperate people to abandon their only source of psychological comfort. The harm reduction approach led to some genuinely useful innovations in how London's alehouses operated during the plague crisis. Establishment owners began watering down drinks to reduce alcohol content while maintaining the psychological benefits of drinking rituals. They started serving food alongside alcohol to slow absorption and reduce the risk of alcohol poisoning. Some alehouses even established informal support networks where regular customers looked after each other's welfare and intervened when someone's drinking became genuinely life-threatening. These innovations weren't based on medical knowledge about addiction treatment or alcohol abuse prevention. They emerged from practical experience with managing large numbers of people who were drinking at dangerous levels while trying to survive an unprecedented crisis. The solutions were imperfect and inconsistent, but they represented genuine attempts to balance people's psychological needs against their physical safety. The Blue Swan Tavern in Whitechapel became famous for its innovative approach to managing customers who were drinking themselves to death. Owner Sarah Blackwood established a system where regular patrons were assigned to informal support groups that monitored each other's consumption and intervened when someone was approaching dangerous levels of intoxication. The groups weren't based on any formal understanding of addiction treatment, but they provided social accountability that helped prevent some of the worst excesses of solitary drinking. Blackwood's system worked by creating artificial social structures that replaced the family and community support networks that had been destroyed by the plague. The support groups gave people reasons to moderate their drinking that went beyond personal health concerns. which were often insufficient motivation for people who were already convinced they were likely to die anyway. The social connections created by the groups also provided alternative sources of psychological comfort that reduced people's complete dependence on alcohol for emotional relief. The success of Blackwood's approach inspired similar innovations at other establishments throughout London, though the specific methods varied depending on the clientele and the owner's personality. Some alehouses established formal rationing systems that limited how much customers could drink in a single session. Others created entertainment programs that gave people activities to do besides drinking. Still others developed credit systems that prevented customers from spending money they needed for basic necessities on alcohol purchases. These grassroots innovations in alcohol harm reduction were probably more effective than any official intervention could have been, because they were designed by people who understood the actual circumstances their customers were facing. The alehouse owners weren't trying to eliminate drinking entirely, which would have been both impossible and psychologically cruel. Instead, they were trying to minimize the most dangerous aspects of heavy drinking while preserving its psychological benefits for people who had no other coping mechanisms available. The innovation process was accelerated by economic incentives that aligned the interests of alehouse owners with the welfare of their customers. Dead customers couldn't buy drinks, and customers who drank themselves into complete incapacitation couldn't earn money to continue purchasing alcohol. Establishment owners had strong financial motivations to keep their regular patrons alive and functional, even if they couldn't keep them sober. Margaret Worthington's establishment, the Golden Heart, developed one of the most sophisticated customer care systems in Plague-era London. Worthington tracked her regular customers' consumption patterns, financial situations, and family circumstances, intervening when she noticed dangerous changes that might indicate someone was sliding toward life-threatening addiction. Her interventions weren't based on moral judgments about drinking, but on practical assessments of what each customer needed to maintain their ability to survive in plague-ravaged London. Worthington's approach required detailed knowledge of her customers' lives that went far beyond normal commercial relationships. She knew which customers were drinking to cope with recent losses, which ones were using alcohol to manage chronic pain or illness, and which ones had developed physical dependencies that made sudden sobriety dangerous. She tailored her service approach to each customer's specific circumstances, sometimes encouraging moderation, and sometimes ensuring that dependent customers maintained access to enough alcohol to avoid dangerous withdrawal symptoms. The personal relationships that Worthington developed with her customers transformed the Golden Heart from a simple drinking establishment into something resembling a combination social service agency and informal medical clinic. Customers brought their problems to Worthington not just because she served alcohol, but because she had become one of the most knowledgeable and trustworthy people in their social network. Her advice about everything from employment opportunities to family conflicts was sought after and respected. The transformation of alehouses into informal community support centres represents one of the most significant social innovations of London's plague crisis. These establishments evolved to fill gaps in social services that had been created when traditional institutions collapsed or became inaccessible. The evolution wasn't planned or coordinated, but it was remarkably consistent across different neighbourhoods and social classes. The success of these innovations suggests that London's plague-era drinking problem might have been even worse if the alehouses hadn't adapted to provide additional forms of support beyond simple alcohol service. The social connections, practical advice, and informal counselling that customers received in well-managed establishments probably prevented some people from descending into complete social isolation and self-destructive behaviour. But the innovations also highlight the inadequacy of London's formal social support systems during the plague crisis. The fact that commercial drinking establishments were providing better social services than churches, medical institutions, or government agencies reveals how completely the city's traditional support structures had collapsed. People were forced to seek help from businesses that existed primarily to sell them alcohol because no other sources of assistance were available. The irony wasn't lost on thoughtful observers like Samuel Pepys, who noted in his diary that London's alehouses were simultaneously the source of many people's problems, and their only reliable source of help for dealing with those problems. The establishments that were enabling destructive drinking habits were also the places where people could find practical assistance, social connection, and emotional support that existed nowhere else in the plague-ravaged city. This paradox created moral dilemmas for alehouse owners who genuinely cared about their customers' welfare, but also needed to maintain profitable businesses during a period when alcohol sales were often their only source of income. The tension between commercial interests and customer welfare was particularly acute for owners who watched regular patrons deteriorate physically and mentally, despite spending most of their waking hours in supposedly supportive environments. William Thornton struggled with this moral complexity throughout his management of the Red Lion Tavern in Southwark. Thornton had inherited the establishment from his father and had always taken pride in maintaining what he considered an ethical business that served its community responsibly. But the plague crisis forced him to choose between maintaining his ethical standards and keeping his business operational during the most challenging period in London's recent history. Thornton's customer base during the plague included several people whose alcohol consumption had clearly become life-threatening, but who also had nowhere else to go for social connection and practical support. If he refused to serve these customers, they would simply drink elsewhere under less safe circumstances, while also losing access to the informal counselling and assistance that the Red Lion provided. If he continued serving them, he was directly contributing to their physical deterioration and possible death. The moral complexity was compounded by Thornton's recognition that his own survival during the plague crisis depended on income from customers whose drinking habits he found ethically problematic. He couldn't afford to turn away paying customers during a period when most of London's economy had collapsed. But he also couldn't ignore the fact that some of those customers were using his establishment to drink themselves to death. Thornton's solution was to develop a complex system of selective service that attempted to balance his customers' immediate needs against their long-term welfare. He would serve dangerous amounts of alcohol to customers who were already physically dependent and might experience life-threatening withdrawal symptoms if denied access to drinks. But he would limit or refuse service to customers who were still in the early stages of developing drinking problems and might be helped by external intervention. The system required Thornton to make medical and psychological assessments that were far beyond his expertise or training. He had to determine which customers were physically dependent on alcohol, which ones were using drinking as a temporary coping mechanism that might resolve naturally, and which ones were sliding toward irreversible addiction that would eventually kill them. The decisions were literally matters of life and death, but Thornton had no reliable way to evaluate the medical and psychological factors that should have informed his choices. The impossibility of making these assessments accurately meant that Thornton's selective service system was inconsistent and sometimes counterproductive. He occasionally refused service to customers who genuinely needed alcohol to avoid dangerous withdrawal symptoms, while continuing to serve customers whose drinking was primarily recreational rather than medically necessary. The mistakes were inevitable, given the complexity of the assessments he was attempting to make without proper training or information. Despite its flaws, Thornton's system represented a genuine attempt to balance competing moral obligations in circumstances where perfect solutions were impossible. The fact that a tavern owner was forced to make complex medical and ethical decisions about his customers' welfare illustrates how completely London's normal support systems had broken down during the plague crisis. People who should have been receiving professional medical and social services were instead dependent on the good intentions and imperfect judgment of business owners who were doing their best to help while also trying to survive. The burden of making these impossible decisions took a significant psychological toll on alehouse owners who took their responsibilities seriously. Many of them began drinking heavily themselves as they struggled to cope with the moral complexity of their situations and the constant exposure to human suffering that their businesses involved. The people who were trying to help London's drinking crisis often became casualties of that crisis themselves. Richard Blackwood's experience managing the Blue Anchor illustrates how this psychological burden could overwhelm even the most well-intentioned business owners. Blackwood had initially approached his plague-era customers with optimism and energy, believing that he could provide meaningful help while also maintaining a profitable business. He developed innovative programs for customer support, established informal counseling services, and created social activities that gave people alternatives to pure alcohol consumption. But the constant exposure to human tragedy eventually broke down Blackwood's psychological defenses. Every day brought new stories of loss, trauma, and desperation from customers who looked to him not just for alcohol, but for guidance, comfort, and hope that he was increasingly unable to provide. The weight of responsibility for other people's welfare became crushing, especially when Blackwood realized that his efforts were having minimal impact on the overall trajectory of his customers' lives. Blackwood's breaking point came when one of his regular customers, a woman named Alice Hartwell, died of alcohol poisoning after a particularly heavy drinking session at the Blue Anchor. Alice had been struggling with severe depression following the deaths of her 3 children, and she had been using alcohol to numb emotional pain that seemed too intense for any human being to bear. Blackwood had tried to monitor Alice's consumption and provide emotional support, but he had failed to recognize how close she was to a complete psychological breakdown. Alice's death forced Blackwood to confront the limits of what he could accomplish as an untrained volunteer trying to provide professional-level social services to people with complex psychological and medical needs. He realized that his efforts to help were sometimes causing more harm than good, and that his establishment was enabling destructive behavior even when he was trying to prevent it. The recognition led to a period of severe depression and guilt that eventually drove Blackwood to close the Blue Anchor permanently. He couldn't continue operating a business that felt morally compromised, but he also couldn't afford to provide the kind of comprehensive help that his customers actually needed. The impossible situation forced him to choose between his own psychological welfare and his sense of responsibility to people who depended on his establishment for survival support. Blackwood's story was repeated throughout London as well-meaning business owners discovered that they lacked the resources, training, and support systems needed to address the complex problems that the plague crisis had created. The informal social services that had emerged in alehouses were better than nothing, but they were inadequate substitutes for the professional medical, psychological, and social support services that London's population actually needed. The inadequacy of these improvised support systems became even more apparent as the plague crisis extended into its 2nd year. Problems that might have been manageable as temporary emergency measures became entrenched patterns of dysfunction when they persisted for months without resolution. Drinking habits that had begun as reasonable responses to extraordinary stress evolved into permanent addictions that continued long after the original stressors had diminished. The transition from emergency coping to chronic dysfunction was particularly visible in families where multiple members had developed serious drinking problems during the plague crisis. The Fletcher family exemplifies this pattern of escalating dysfunction that eventually consumed entire households. Before the plague, the Fletchers had been a stable, prosperous family with strong social connections and clear plans for their future. Father Thomas was a successful cloth merchant. Mother Elizabeth managed the household and raised their 4 children, and the family was actively involved in their parish community. The plague's impact on the Fletcher family was gradual but relentless. Thomas's business collapsed when trade routes were disrupted and customers stopped purchasing non-essential goods. Elizabeth became increasingly isolated as social gatherings were cancelled and neighbours began avoiding contact with each other. The children's education was interrupted when schools closed, leaving them with nothing to do but worry about the disease that was killing people throughout their neighbourhood. The family's initial response to these stresses was to maintain normal routines as much as possible while making reasonable adjustments to accommodate the changing circumstances. Thomas looked for new business opportunities that might work despite the plague disruptions. Elizabeth focused on maintaining household stability and keeping the children occupied with productive activities. The family attended religious services when possible and maintained contact with friends and relatives through letters and brief visits. But as the plague crisis continued month after month, the Fletcher family's coping strategies began to break down under the sustained pressure. Thomas couldn't find viable business opportunities in London's collapsed economy, and his savings were rapidly depleting. Elizabeth found it increasingly difficult to maintain household routines when basic supplies became expensive and hard to obtain. The children became restless and difficult to manage as their confinement continued indefinitely. The family's turn toward alcohol as a coping mechanism began innocently enough. Thomas started drinking wine with dinner to help him relax after days spent searching unsuccessfully for work or business opportunities. Elizabeth began having a glass of ale in the afternoon to steady her nerves before dealing with the children's evening routine. The parents told themselves that moderate drinking was a reasonable way to manage stress during an unprecedented crisis. But the moderate drinking quickly escalated as the external stresses continued to mount, and the alcohol's effectiveness began to diminish. Thomas needed larger amounts of wine to achieve the same relaxing effects, and he began drinking earlier in the day to cope with the anxiety of waking up to face another day of unemployment and financial insecurity. Elizabeth's afternoon ale became morning ale, then continuous drinking throughout the day as she struggled to manage household responsibilities while worrying constantly about her family's future. The children initially tried to maintain normal family relationships despite their parents' changing behavior, but they gradually began adopting drinking habits themselves as their own stress levels became unbearable. 16-year-old Michael started stealing wine from his father's supply, telling himself that he needed alcohol to cope with the terrifying uncertainty of not knowing whether his family would survive the plague crisis. 14-year-old Sarah began drinking ale with her mother, finding that alcohol made their conversations more bearable and helped her forget about the friends and neighbours who had died. Within 6 months, the entire Fletcher family was drinking heavily throughout most of their waking hours. Their household routines had completely broken down. Their financial situation had become desperate, as money needed for food and rent was spent on alcohol instead. Their social connections had largely disappeared as other families avoided contact with people whose behaviour had become erratic and unpredictable. The family's dysfunction created a feedback loop that made their situation progressively worse rather than better. Their heavy drinking made it impossible for Thomas to pursue employment opportunities effectively, which increased the family's financial stress, which led to even heavier drinking. Elizabeth's intoxication made it impossible for her to manage the household properly, which created additional stress for everyone, which led to more drinking. The children's alcohol consumption interfered with their ability to help with family responsibilities, which increased the burden on their parents, which led to more family conflict and more drinking. By the time the Fletcher family recognized that their drinking had become a serious problem, they were too physically and psychologically dependent on alcohol to address the issue effectively. Thomas experienced severe withdrawal symptoms when he tried to reduce his consumption, including tremors, nausea, and anxiety attacks that were more unbearable than the problems he had been trying to solve by drinking. Elizabeth's attempts to cut back on her alcohol intake led to insomnia and depression that made it impossible for her to function as a parent and household manager. The children found themselves trapped in a situation where they needed to drink to cope with living in a dysfunctional household, but where their drinking was also contributing to the household's dysfunction. The family had created a system where everyone's problems were both caused by and temporarily relieved by alcohol consumption, making it impossible to break the cycle without external intervention that simply wasn't available. The Fletcher family story illustrates how the plague crisis could transform functional families into completely dysfunctional units in a relatively short period of time. The transformation wasn't the result of moral weakness or character flaws, but rather the predictable outcome of sustained stress combined with inadequate support systems and dangerous coping mechanisms. Thousands of London families followed similar trajectories during the plague crisis, creating a generation of children who grew up in households where alcohol dependence was normal and functional family relationships were impossible. The long-term consequences of these family breakdowns wouldn't become fully apparent until years after the plague ended, when survivors tried to rebuild their lives and communities. Many people discovered that the coping mechanisms they had developed during the plague crisis had become permanent features of their personalities and relationships. The drinking habits that had begun as temporary responses to extraordinary circumstances had evolved into chronic addictions that persisted long after the original stressors had disappeared. The persistence of plague-era drinking habits created ongoing social problems that London struggled to address for decades after the disease itself had been conquered. The city found itself dealing with thousands of people who had developed serious alcohol dependencies during the plague crisis and who lacked access to effective treatment resources. The informal support systems that had emerged in alehouses during the plague were inadequate for addressing chronic addiction problems that required professional medical and psychological intervention. The inadequacy of post-plague addiction treatment options meant that many survivors remained trapped in destructive drinking patterns for the rest of their lives. People who might have recovered from their alcohol dependencies with proper support instead became permanent casualties of the plague crisis, even though they had survived the disease itself. The human cost of London's plague-era drinking binge extended far beyond the immediate crisis period and affected entire families and communities for generations. The transformation of London's drinking culture during the plague wasn't just about individual choices or family breakdowns. It was reshaping the very fabric of how the city functioned as a society. By the winter of 1665, entire neighbourhoods had essentially reorganised themselves around alcohol consumption, creating micro-communities where drinking establishments served as the primary social, economic, and even governmental institutions. Consider the case of Pudding Lane, a street that would later become famous for entirely different reasons. Before the plague, this narrow thoroughfare housed a mix of bakers, carpenters, and small merchants who maintained the kind of tight-knit community relationships that characterised working-class London neighbourhoods. People knew their neighbours, shared resources during difficult times, and looked out for each other's children and elderly relatives. But as the plague carved through the street's population, the survivors found themselves living among empty houses and abandoned shops that served as constant reminders of their losses. The normal rhythms of neighbourhood life, morning conversations between housewives, children playing in the street, evening gatherings of men discussing work and politics, all disappeared as people became too afraid of infection and too overwhelmed by grief to maintain casual social connections. The void was filled by the Cock and Bull Tavern, which became the de facto centre of what remained of Pudding Lane's community life. Owner Janet Moorcock had initially tried to maintain normal business operations, serving moderate amounts of alcohol to customers who came for brief social visits before returning to their homes and families. But as her customer base shifted from people seeking temporary relaxation to people seeking permanent escape from unbearable circumstances, Moorcock found herself managing what amounted to a refugee camp disguised as a drinking establishment. The transformation happened gradually enough that Moorcock didn't realise how dramatically her business had changed until she tried to take inventory of her regular customers and discovered that most of them were essentially living at the Cock and Bull. They arrived in the morning and stayed until closing time, leaving only to sleep before returning the next day to repeat the cycle. Some customers had stopped maintaining their own homes entirely, preferring to spend every waking hour in the tavern's communal atmosphere rather than facing the isolation and memories that waited in their empty houses. Moorcock's response to this transformation reveals the kind of practical creativity that many business owners developed during the plague crisis. Instead of trying to force her customers back into normal drinking patterns that no longer matched their circumstances, she adapted her services to accommodate their actual needs. She began serving simple meals throughout the day so that customers wouldn't have to choose between eating and drinking. She allowed people to sleep at tables when they were too intoxicated to make it home safely. She even started acting as an informal banker, holding money for customers who were afraid they would spend everything on alcohol if they kept it themselves. The Cock and Bull evolved into something that had no precedent in London's commercial history. It wasn't quite a hotel because customers didn't rent rooms. It wasn't quite a restaurant because food was secondary to alcohol service. It wasn't quite a boarding house because there were no formal residential arrangements. Instead, it was a new type of institution that combined elements of all these functions while serving a population whose needs couldn't be met by traditional commercial establishments. The innovation wasn't unique to Moorcock's establishment. Across London, alehouse owners were discovering that their customers' plague-era drinking habits required entirely new approaches to hospitality and business management. The old model of serving drinks to people who would consume them and then leave was completely inadequate for dealing with customers who needed alcohol to function throughout their entire waking day. Thomas Hartwell's establishment, the Swan and Crown in Cheapside, developed one of the most elaborate customer care systems in plague-era London. Hartwell had recognised that his customers weren't just buying alcohol, they were essentially purchasing daily membership in a surrogate family structure that provided emotional support, practical assistance, and social connection that existed nowhere else in their lives. Hartwell's innovation was to formalise this surrogate family concept by creating what he called drinking partnerships. Groups of regular customers were organised into informal households of 6 to 8 people who looked after each other's welfare, shared resources, and provided mutual support during crises. The partnerships weren't based on existing friendships or family relationships, but rather on compatibility of drinking habits and complementary practical skills. Each partnership included people with different abilities that contributed to the group's collective survival. Someone who was still capable of earning money through work or trade would contribute to the partnership's alcohol purchases. Someone with cooking skills would prepare meals for the group. Someone with medical knowledge would provide basic healthcare for partnership members who became sick or injured. Someone with social connections would gather information about plague developments and survival opportunities. The system worked because it recreated some of the mutual support functions that had been provided by extended families and neighbourhood communities before the plague crisis destroyed those traditional social structures. People who had lost their biological families found themselves with chosen families that provided many of the same emotional and practical benefits, even though the relationships were mediated by shared alcohol consumption rather than blood ties or long-term personal history. But the drinking partnerships also revealed the extent to which London's plague-era social innovations were dependent on continuous alcohol availability. When partnerships couldn't afford sufficient alcohol for all their members, the groups often fell apart as individuals prioritised their own drinking needs over their obligations to the partnership. The social bonds that alcohol had made possible were also fragile enough to be destroyed by alcohol scarcity. Mary Whitfield experienced this fragility firsthand when the drinking partnership she had joined at the Swan and Crown collapsed during a period when rising alcohol prices made group purchases unaffordable. Mary had contributed her sewing skills to the partnership, mending clothes and creating useful household items in exchange for her share of the group's alcohol purchases. She had formed genuine emotional attachments to her partnership members and had begun to think of them as her new family. But when alcohol became too expensive for the partnership to maintain its usual consumption levels, the group dynamics changed dramatically. Members began hoarding individual resources instead of sharing them collectively. Accusations of unfairness and selfishness poisoned relationships that had previously been supportive and caring. Within weeks, the partnership had dissolved entirely, leaving Mary and the other members more isolated and desperate than they had been before joining the group. The collapse of Mary's drinking partnership illustrates a fundamental weakness in London's plague-era social innovations. The new community structures that emerged during the crisis were often more fragile than the traditional institutions they had replaced, because they were built around shared coping mechanisms rather than shared values or long-term mutual interests. When the coping mechanisms became unavailable or insufficient, the communities built around them often disintegrated completely. This fragility became increasingly problematic as the plague crisis extended beyond what anyone had expected. Social innovations that worked well as temporary emergency measures became unsustainable when they were required to function for months or years without resolution. The drinking partnerships, informal support networks, and surrogate family structures that had emerged in London's alehouses were never designed to be permanent social institutions, and they began breaking down under the stress of extended operation. The breakdown was accelerated by the fact that many participants in these informal social structures were becoming increasingly dysfunctional as their alcohol consumption escalated beyond sustainable levels. People who had initially been valuable contributors to their drinking partnerships gradually became burdens as their addiction progressed to the point where they couldn't perform basic tasks or maintain normal social relationships. William Blackwood's drinking partnership at the Red Hart Tavern provides a tragic example of how individual addiction could destroy group dynamics. Blackwood had initially been one of the most valuable members of his 6-person partnership, contributing both money and practical skills that helped the group survive during the early months of the plague crisis. He was known for his reliability, his willingness to help other partnership members during difficulties, and his ability to maintain functional relationships even while drinking heavily. But Blackwood's alcohol tolerance continued to increase throughout the plague crisis, and his consumption gradually escalated to levels that made normal social interaction impossible. He became argumentative and unpredictable while intoxicated, starting conflicts with partnership members over trivial issues. He began neglecting his responsibilities to the group, failing to contribute his promised share of money and labor. Most seriously, he started stealing alcohol from other partnership members when his own supply was insufficient to maintain his required consumption levels. The other partnership members initially tried to accommodate Blackwood's deteriorating behavior because they understood that he was struggling with problems beyond his control. They made excuses for his failures, covered his financial shortfalls, and tried to provide the kind of support that might help him regain his previous level of functioning. But their efforts were undermined by their own increasing alcohol dependencies, which made it difficult for them to maintain the energy and clarity needed to help someone else with similar problems. The breaking point came when Blackwood's stealing escalated to the point where other partnership members couldn't afford to maintain their own alcohol consumption. The group faced a choice between enabling Blackwood's addiction at the cost of their own survival, or excluding him from the partnership despite their emotional attachments to him as a friend and chosen family member. The decision was agonizing because it meant abandoning someone who desperately needed help. But it was also necessary because the partnership couldn't function with a member who was actively undermining the group's ability to survive. Blackwood's expulsion from his drinking partnership left him completely isolated in a city where social connections had become essential for survival. He had burned bridges with his biological family through previous alcohol-related conflicts, and he lacked the resources to establish new relationships with people who didn't know about his addiction problems. The isolation accelerated his psychological decline and made his drinking even more destructive and self-defeating. The tragedy of Blackwood's situation was that the very community structure that had initially helped him survive the plague crisis became another casualty of his addiction. The drinking partnership that had provided him with emotional support, practical assistance, and social connection was destroyed by the same alcohol dependency that had made the partnership necessary in the first place. The cycle was self-defeating in ways that trapped people like Blackwood in progressively worsening circumstances. Similar cycles of community creation and destruction were playing out throughout London as the plague crisis extended beyond what anyone had anticipated. The informal social structures that had emerged during the early months of the crisis were proving inadequate for long-term survival. But the traditional institutions that might have provided more sustainable support were still either destroyed or inaccessible to most plague survivors. The gap between what people needed and what was available created opportunities for more ambitious social innovations, but it also created space for exploitation by people who recognized that desperate circumstances made survivors vulnerable to manipulation and abuse. Some alehouse owners began taking advantage of their customers' dependencies by charging excessive prices, providing unsafe drinking environments, or exploiting the labor of people who were too intoxicated to protect their own interests effectively. Margaret Thornfield's experience with the Golden Swan Tavern illustrates how this exploitation could develop even in establishments that had initially provided genuine support to their customers. Thornfield had been patronizing the Golden Swan since the early days of the plague crisis, when owner Robert Hayes had established innovative customer support programs and maintained reasonable prices despite the increasing scarcity of alcohol supplies. But as Hayes watched his customers become increasingly desperate and dependent, he gradually began adjusting his business practices to take advantage of their vulnerabilities. He raised prices beyond what most customers could afford, then offered credit arrangements that trapped people in debt cycles they couldn't escape. He began charging fees for services that had previously been provided for free, like allowing customers to sleep at tables or store personal belongings in the tavern. Most exploitatively, Hayes started requiring customers to perform labor in exchange for alcohol, creating what amounted to indentured servitude relationships with people whose judgment was too impaired to recognize that they were being cheated. Customers like Thornfield found themselves working long hours for minimal alcohol compensation, while also paying inflated prices for additional drinks they needed to maintain their consumption levels. The exploitation was particularly insidious because it was embedded within relationships that still provided some of the emotional support and social connection that customers desperately needed. Hayes hadn't abandoned the customer care programs that had made the Golden Swan popular. He had simply monetized them in ways that extracted maximum profit from people who had no alternative sources of support. Thornfield's recognition that she was being exploited came gradually as she began comparing her treatment at the Golden Swan with conditions at other establishments. She discovered that she was paying significantly more for alcohol than customers at comparable taverns, and that the labor she was performing for Hayes was worth much more than the drinks she received in compensation. But her discovery of the exploitation didn't immediately lead to action because she was afraid that leaving the Golden Swan would mean losing access to the social relationships and daily structure that had become essential for her psychological survival. The fear of isolation kept Thornfield trapped in an exploitative relationship long after she had recognized that she was being cheated. Her situation illustrates how the collapse of traditional social support systems during the plague crisis created conditions where people could be systematically taken advantage of by individuals who understood their vulnerabilities and dependencies. The exploitation wasn't limited to commercial relationships between alehouse owners and customers. The desperate circumstances that characterized plague-era London created opportunities for interpersonal exploitation within the informal communities that had developed around alcohol consumption. People who maintained slightly better functioning than their peers often used their relative advantages to manipulate and control others who were more severely compromised by addiction or trauma. James Whitmore had managed to maintain steady employment as a carpenter throughout most of the plague crisis, which gave him financial resources that many of his drinking companions at the Bull and Bear Tavern lacked. Initially, Whitmore used his advantages generously, buying drinks for friends who couldn't afford their own, and providing practical assistance to people who were struggling with basic survival tasks. But Whitmore's generosity gradually evolved into a system of control that allowed him to manipulate other customers' behavior in ways that served his own psychological needs. He began offering financial assistance in exchange for companionship and attention, creating relationships where desperate people felt obligated to spend time with him and listen to his problems in return for access to alcohol they couldn't otherwise afford. The relationships weren't explicitly coercive, but they were characterized by power imbalances that made genuine friendship impossible. Whitmore's companions were never sure whether their interactions with him were based on mutual affection or economic necessity, and Whitmore himself seemed to prefer the ambiguity because it allowed him to believe that people chose to spend time with him for reasons other than money. The psychological dynamics of these relationships were complex and unhealthy for everyone involved. Whitmore was using his financial resources to purchase social connection and emotional intimacy that he couldn't achieve through normal relationship-building processes, while his companions were trading their autonomy and authentic emotional responses for access to resources they needed to survive. Neither side of these relationships was getting what they actually needed, but the arrangements provided enough temporary satisfaction to both parties that they persisted despite being fundamentally unsatisfying. The prevalence of these exploitative relationships throughout London's plague-era drinking communities reveals how the crisis had damaged people's ability to form healthy social connections. The normal processes of friendship and community building had been disrupted by trauma, addiction, and desperate circumstances, to the point where many people no longer remembered how to relate to each other without manipulation, coercion, or exploitation. The damage to London's social fabric was perhaps most visible in the relationships between parents and children, whose family structures had been disrupted by the plague crisis. Traditional parental authority had been undermined by circumstances that made adults appear helpless and ineffective, while children were forced to take on responsibilities that were far beyond their developmental capabilities. The resulting confusion created family dynamics that were often characterized by resentment, manipulation, and mutual exploitation rather than love and mutual support. 15-year-old Catherine Mills found herself serving as the primary caretaker for her alcoholic mother after the plague killed her father and younger siblings. Catherine's mother, Elizabeth, had been a competent parent before the plague, but her drinking had escalated to the point where she couldn't perform basic household tasks or make rational decisions about family welfare. Catherine was forced to assume adult responsibilities while still being treated as a child when it came to authority and decision-making. The role reversal created a relationship dynamic that was emotionally damaging for both Catherine and Elizabeth. Catherine resented having to care for an adult who should have been caring for her, while Elizabeth felt guilty and defensive about her dependence on her teenage daughter. Neither of them had the emotional tools needed to navigate their reversed relationship roles in healthy ways, and both began using alcohol to numb the pain and confusion that their situation created. Catherine's drinking began as an attempt to cope with the overwhelming stress of managing adult responsibilities while still being a child, psychologically and socially. She discovered that alcohol made it easier to perform caretaking tasks that were emotionally unbearable when approached with full awareness of their significance. Feeding her intoxicated mother, cleaning up after her accidents, and managing the family's finances while her mother was unconscious, all became more tolerable when Catherine was partially intoxicated herself. But Catherine's alcohol use quickly escalated beyond what was necessary for stress management and became a way of asserting adult status that she felt she had earned through her caretaking responsibilities. If she was performing adult roles, she reasoned, then she deserved access to adult privileges like drinking. The logic was understandable, but it led Catherine into addiction patterns that undermined her ability to function as either a child or an adult effectively. The relationship between Catherine and Elizabeth became increasingly characterized by mutual enabling, as both of them used alcohol to avoid dealing with the emotional complexity of their reversed roles. Elizabeth felt less guilty about her dependence when Catherine was also drinking heavily, while Catherine felt less resentful about her caretaking responsibilities when she could blame them on her mother's drinking, rather than acknowledging her own role in maintaining their dysfunctional dynamic. The cycle of mutual enabling that developed between Catherine and Elizabeth was replicated in thousands of families throughout Plague-era London, where traditional authority structures had been disrupted by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Parents who had lost their ability to provide effective leadership for their families often turned their children into enablers who helped maintain destructive coping mechanisms rather than challenging them. Children who were forced into premature adult responsibilities often used alcohol to cope with the emotional burden, creating additional problems that their parents were too compromised to address effectively. These family dynamics created a generation of young people who grew up with profoundly distorted understanding of normal adult relationships and responsibilities. Children like Catherine learned that love and care could be expressed through enabling destructive behavior, and that adult authority was something to be manipulated and circumvented rather than respected and internalized as a model for future behavior. The long-term consequences of these damaged family relationships wouldn't become fully apparent until years after the plague ended, when survivors tried to establish normal families of their own. Many people discovered that their plague-era experiences had left them without adequate models for healthy parenting, partnership, or community participation. The social skills that people normally acquire through childhood observation of functional adult relationships had been replaced by survival skills that were adapted to crisis situations but were counterproductive in normal circumstances. Elizabeth Hartwell's attempt to establish a normal household after the plague illustrates the challenges that survivors faced when trying to rebuild functional family relationships, plague years managing her alcohol. Elizabeth had spent the husband and 3 children in circumstances where survival required constant crisis management and moral flexibility. She had become expert at manipulating, bribing, and threatening family members to maintain basic household functioning. But she had lost dynamics that characterized healthy families. When touched with the collaborative and supportive relationship the plague ended, and circumstances began to normalize, Elizabeth discovered that she didn't know how to relate to her family members without alcohol-mediated crisis dynamics. She had become accustomed to making all important decisions unilaterally because her husband had been too intoxicated to participate in family planning. She had developed habits of controlling her children through guilt and manipulation because normal parental authority had been ineffective during the crisis years. Elizabeth's family members had also adapted to crisis mode relationships in ways that made normal family functioning difficult. Her husband had become accustomed to avoiding responsibility for family welfare, while her children had learned to circumvent parental authority through deception and manipulation. Everyone in the family had survival skills that were adapted to dysfunctional circumstances, but none of them remembered how to participate in the kind of stable, supportive relationships that they all claimed to want. The transition from crisis survival to normal family functioning proved to be almost as challenging as surviving the plague itself had been. Elizabeth's family spent years trying to unlearn the destructive relationship patterns they had developed during the plague crisis, with mixed success. Some family members were able to adapt to healthier relationship dynamics, while others remained trapped in crisis mode behaviors that were no longer necessary but had become psychologically comfortable through long practice. The difficulty of transitioning from crisis relationships to normal relationships was compounded by the fact that most plague survivors had limited access to models of healthy functioning that might have guided their recovery efforts. The traditional institutions that normally provided guidance for family and community relationship building had been damaged or destroyed during the plague crisis, leaving people to figure out recovery processes through trial and error without professional guidance or community support. The absence of institutional support for post-plague recovery meant that many of the social innovations that had emerged during the crisis persisted long after they were needed, simply because people didn't know what should replace them. Drinking partnerships, informal support networks, and crisis management relationship dynamics continued to characterize many survivors' social lives for years after the plague ended, creating communities that were permanently organized around emergency response behaviors. The persistence of crisis mode social organization had profound implications for London's long-term social and economic development. Communities that remained organized around short-term survival priorities were less effective at pursuing the kind of long-term planning and investment that supported economic growth and social stability. People who had learned to prioritize immediate needs over future planning continued to make decisions that were rational for crisis survival, but counterproductive for normal social and economic development. The economic implications were particularly significant because London's recovery from the plague crisis required exactly the kind of long-term planning and investment that crisis mode thinking made difficult. Rebuilding the city's commercial infrastructure, re-establishing trade relationships, and developing new economic opportunities all required people to delay immediate gratification in favor of future benefits. But many plague survivors had lost the ability to make those kinds of calculations because their crisis experiences had taught them that planning for the future was pointless and that immediate survival was the only rational priority. Thomas Blackwood's post-plague business ventures illustrate how crisis mode thinking could undermine economic recovery efforts. Blackwood had been a successful merchant before the plague, known for his ability to identify long-term market trends and make investments that paid off over months or years. But his plague-era experiences had taught him that circumstances could change so rapidly and dramatically that long-term planning was essentially gambling with resources that might be needed for immediate survival. When London's economy began recovering after the plague ended, Blackwood was presented with numerous investment opportunities that would have been highly profitable for someone willing to tie up capital for extended periods. But Blackwood had lost the ability to think beyond immediate needs and immediate returns. He passed up potentially lucrative long-term investments in favor of short-term opportunities that provided immediate cash flow but limited growth potential. Blackwood's short-term thinking was rational from the perspective of someone whose survival had depended on maintaining immediate access to resources during the plague crisis. But it was counterproductive in post-plague circumstances where economic success required exactly the kind of long-term planning and delayed gratification that crisis survival had made psychologically impossible for many people. The persistence of crisis mode economic thinking throughout London's survivor population meant that the city's economic recovery was slower and less complete than it might have been if people had been able to transition more effectively from survival priorities to growth priorities. The human capital that London needed for economic rebuilding was available, but much of it was organised around crisis management rather than development planning. The challenge was compounded by the fact that many survivors continued to use alcohol to manage the psychological aftermath of their plague experiences, which interfered with their ability to engage in the kind of focused, long-term thinking that economic rebuilding required. People who had used drinking as their primary coping mechanism during the plague often found it difficult to develop alternative stress management approaches that would support more productive post-plague activities. The relationship between continued heavy drinking and impaired economic recovery wasn't immediately obvious because London's post-plague economy initially provided numerous opportunities for people whose thinking remained organised around short-term survival priorities. The city needed massive amounts of immediate labour for cleaning, rebuilding, and re-establishing basic services. People who were good at crisis management and short-term problem-solving were initially valuable contributors to recovery efforts. But as London's immediate recovery needs were met and the focus shifted from emergency response to long-term development, people whose skills and thinking patterns remained organised around crisis management became less valuable and more marginalised. The economic opportunities available to heavy drinkers gradually diminished as the city's economy evolved beyond emergency response mode, creating a population of people who were increasingly disconnected from London's economic mainstream. The marginalisation of heavy drinkers in London's recovering economy created social problems that persisted for decades after the plague ended. People who had been valuable community members before the plague and essential survival resources during the plague found themselves economically and socially irrelevant in post-plague London. The transition from being needed to being marginalised was psychologically devastating for many survivors and contributed to continued heavy drinking that made their economic and social integration even more difficult. Margaret Thornfield's experience illustrates how this marginalization process could destroy people who had successfully survived the plague crisis but couldn't adapt to post-plague social and economic expectations. Thornfield had been an essential member of her drinking partnership during the plague, contributing practical skills and emotional support that helped her group survive when traditional support systems had collapsed. She had developed a strong sense of personal worth based on her ability to help others during extreme circumstances. But when London's recovery eliminated the need for the kind of crisis management skills that Thornfield had mastered, she found herself without a clear social or economic role. The post-plague economy valued different skills than those that had been essential during the crisis, and Thornfield's continued heavy drinking made it difficult for her to learn new approaches to work and social relationships. London's plague era wasn't just a story about disease and death. It was about an entire city drowning its terror in ale and wine, creating a drunken spiral that lasted long after the plague itself had ended. From William Boghurst's medical delusions to Margaret Thornfield's tragic marginalization, we've seen how alcohol became both salvation and destruction for thousands of survivors. The alehouses that promised escape became prisons of addiction, and the liquid courage that helped people face another day ultimately robbed them of their futures. The next time you raise a glass, remember London's plague survivors, who discovered that sometimes the cure can be deadlier than the disease itself.